Hi everyone, welcome back to the second lesson on this novel, The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Today we're going to go over the first 10 or so chapters of the novel. We're going to go through, I'm going to pick out some key passages I think, and I'm going to link them to the arguments that I started making last week. So just in recap of what I did last week we talked a lot about the context of the novel. So what environment it was written in and what J.D. Salinger was influenced by. Last week we talked a lot about the post-war environment, how J.D. Salinger meant for The Catcher in the Rye to be a post-war novel which explored the anxieties of America after World War II and how lots of people didn't trust their institutions. I also talked about how it was a coming-of-age novel. So coming-of-age novel is about a teenager growing up to be mature. It was sort of almost the first of its kind, not really, but it was the first popular novel that tackled directly the idea of being a teenager. I also talked about how this use of a teenager is meant to be a little bit symbolic. So it's not meant to be, after all, and I don't know if a lot of you know this, but J.D. Salinger actually wrote this novel for adults. He didn't actually write it for children or teenagers, as a matter of fact. He actually wrote it for adults. And I think what's interesting is if you consider that in the context of the fact that the protagonist is a teenager, it starts to bring up a lot of questions like, why did he do it in the first place? And that was the question that I posed to you at the end of last week. And luckily, we've had some answers on the YouTube comment section, which some of them have been very good, some of them could be a little bit better. So overall, there were lots of answers about how, J.D. Salinger wanted to tell his audience about what it was like being a teenager, about mood swings and changes in biology and puberty and things like that. Well, I personally think that that might be part of it, but it's certainly only a surface level appreciation of what J.D. Salinger is trying to do. I don't personally think the novel is actually really about, or the main focus or the main message is about trying to illuminate the experience of being a teenager. That's certainly part of it, but it's definitely not the main purpose of why he chose to use a teenager in the first place. Basically, what I believe and what some answers picked up on is the idea that J.D. Salinger is using this teenager as a symbol, as a mouthpiece for the anxieties that people experienced in America after World War II. Why does he choose to use a teenager? Because a teenager naturally has those kinds of anxieties in their life. Fear of the institution, fear of authority, and things like that. So J.D. Salinger used this teenager as a kind of symbolic means to represent everyone in America, okay? So I personally think that's probably why he chooses to use why J.D. Salinger chooses to use Holden Caulfield as a protagonist, although I'm sure part of it is also, like some of you have picked up, trying to illuminate the experience of being a teenager. I just don't think that's the main point. Let's keep going now. What we're going to do now is I've picked out about 5 passages from the first 10 chapters of the novel. Okay, so as I said before, there will be 3 parts. There will be part 1, which is the first 10 chapters, part 2, which is the next 10 chapters, and then chapter 20 to 26, which is the last 6 or 7 chapters. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to go through the first 10 chapters and pick out some parts that I want to discuss to you about. I'm going to read them, and then we're going to talk about why they're important. Okay, first of all, let's talk a little bit about Holden Caulfield's quote from chapter 1. What I was really hanging around for, I was trying to feel some kind of goodbye. I mean, I've left schools and places I didn't even know I was leaving them. I hate that. I don't care if it's sad goodbye or a bad goodbye, but when I leave a place, I like to know I'm leaving it. If you don't, you feel even worse. So what's really interesting here is 2 things. First of all, as some of you who have started reading the novel already have come to realize, it's written in a very interesting character voice. So it's not like other novels where you have like a kind of omniscient third-person narrator who's narrating everything, like for example Harry Potter, right? This is written directly from inside the mind of Holden Caulfield, right? You're actually hearing his thoughts. It's almost like he's talking to you and you're like kind of a friend, a really, really casual, informal friend. So it's actually quite interesting. Now, a couple of reasons why J.D. Salinger does this. First of all, it's kind of like a stream of consciousness novel. So what's a stream of consciousness novel? It's basically a novel where you hear all the characters' thoughts. Nothing is held back from you. You are basically taking on, entering the body and entering the mind of the character themselves. So it's not just like, there's a third person, like I said, godlike narrator who narrates everything. You're actually inside the head of the character. That's really interesting because it allows for the full honesty of the characters to come through. right? So for example, in other novels, for example, like Victorian novels, which are often narrated, okay, some characters can deceive other people and you never really know what's going on and what they're thinking about, just like all the other characters in the novel. In a stream of consciousness novel like this one, you know everything. You know everything they're thinking and you know exactly their motivation. So it's quite an interesting way to write. Second of all, why this is interesting is it's because J.D. Salinger is using a lot of the slang of the time, how people actually talked and where he lived, which was like New York and surrounding the sort of East Coast of America where he lived at the time. So you can actually pick up a lot of the cultural dialect and, you know, ways that people talked back then. What's interesting about this quote that I just read is it establishes the central paradox of Holden Caulfield's character that's going to be carried out throughout the rest of the entire novel, which is the idea that Holden Caulfield feels incredibly lonely. Okay, he really desires connections with other people. He tries to find them in everywhere he goes. So he feels lonely, but he also doesn't want to invest anything in order to make a connection. Let me try to explain that a little bit more because it might be confusing. Holden Caulfield is a very internally conflicted character, okay? He feels very sad all the time. He says he's depressed all the time, okay? Because he can't find a connection with anyone. He can't find emotional connections with his teachers. He can't find emotional connections with religion, with adults, even with members of the opposite gender, right? Like girls and stuff. But he also doesn't want to invest anything, or he doesn't want to make himself vulnerable to other people because he's afraid of being hurt by them. And therefore what happens is, it's a paradox, right? Because he doesn't, want to be in a position where he can connect with other people, but he also desperately wants to connect with other people. And this paradox is meant to represent a little bit of that post-war environment like I was talking about last week and earlier in this video, okay? So the post-war environment was all full of these sorts of paradoxical, contradictory anxieties throughout society. And in this case, the desire to want to reach out, but also holding oneself back is definitely what a lot of people felt about their authorities and their leaders, okay? So lots of people felt really lost after World War II in America because one, they could no longer trust their institutions and their authority figures, okay? So they felt really lost. They really felt lonely, like there was no one guiding them. But they also didn't want to make themselves vulnerable to authority figures and leaders because they knew how terrible they could be. So people were trapped in this sort of paradox. Let's move on to a quote from chapter 2. One of the biggest reasons I left Elkton Hills was because I was surrounded by phonies. That's all. They were coming in the goddamn window. For instance, they had this headmaster, Mr. Haas, that was the phoniest bastard I ever met in my life. 10 times worse than old Thurmer. On Sundays, for instance, old Haas went around shaking hands with everybody's parents when they drove up to school. He'd be charming as hell and all, even if some boy had little, odd, old, funny-looking parents. You should have seen the way he did with my roommate's parents. I mean, if a boy's mother was sort of fat or corny looking or something, and if someone's father was one of those guys that wear those suits with very big shoulders and corny black and white shoes, then old Haas would just shake hands with them and give them a phony smile, and then he'd go talk for maybe half an hour with somebody else's parents. I can't stand that stuff. It drives me crazy. It makes me so depressed I go crazy. I hate that goddamn Elkton Hills. So what this quote is trying to demonstrate to us is basically Holden Caulfield is rebelling not against the ideas and the fundamental values of institutions, but more the people in them, the authority figures and the adults and the leaders that are in these factions and these institutions. So he doesn't hate the act of learning, right? You know that from the first chapter and from this quote here, that he doesn't necessarily hate school because he hates learning and he hates education. He doesn't want to find out more about things, okay? He hates school mainly because of the people that he's surrounded by, the other kids which he can't connect with, and the adults who seem to just, be really fake and phony, like he says, or treat him really meanly. And this was the experience of a lot of people after World War II in that post-war environment. So for example, we'll hear some quotes later on about religion and things like that. But for example, with the government, right? So people, they didn't hate the idea of having a government. Obviously, having a government was good because they would care after you, right? They just didn't trust politicians. They didn't trust the people who were vulnerable and exploitable and phony, and they would manipulate people, okay? So that's definitely a reflection of that outside world. Let's look at something from chapter 3, which also demonstrates the same thing. Where I lived at Pensy, I lived in the Ossenberger Memorial Wing of the new dorms. It was named after this guy Ossenberger who went to Pensy. He made a pot of dough in the undertaking business after he got out of Pensy. He made a speech that lasted about 10 hours. He started off with about 50 corny jokes just to show us what a regular guy he was. Very big deal. Then he started telling us how he was never ashamed when he was in some kind of trouble or something to get right down to his knees and pray to God. He told us we should always pray to God, talk to him and all, wherever we were. He told us we ought to think of Jesus as our buddy and all. He said he talked to Jesus all the time, even when driving in his car. That killed me. I just see the big phony bastard shifting into first gear and asking Jesus to send him a few more stiffs. So in this case, we see another example of Holden Caulfield. He's rebelling, but he's not rebelling against the actual fundamental ideas of the institutions. He doesn't say, I hate God, I think Jesus is fake. He says, I hate the people who are preaching Jesus, who are following the church as leaders, who are telling everyone to preach in Jesus. Because he sees like, people's actions and their beliefs don't quite seem to match up. Right? And I think this really reflects to the context as well. So a lot of people in that time saw the church as this sort of business, right? They were just getting money from people, they were accruing followers, but that wasn't where their heart was, right? The heart of the church is meant to be spreading religion, meant to be converting new people and spreading the love of God. Lots of people thought in that post-war environment, it was run more like a business and a church. And in this case, Holden Caulfield is the mouthpiece for J.D. Salinger to try to express that opinion. Okay, a couple of quotes now. This one's from chapter 7. Listen, what's the routine on joining a monastery? I asked him. I was sort of toying with the idea of joining one. Do you have to be a Catholic and all? Certainly you have to be a Catholic. You bastard, did you just wake me up to ask me these dumb questions? Go back to sleep. I'm not going to join one anyway. The kind of luck I have, I'd probably just join one with all the wrong kinds of monks in it. All stupid bastards, or just bastards. When I said that, old Ackley sat way the hell up in his bed. Listen, I don't care what you say about me or anything, but if you start making cracks on my goddamn religion, for Christ's sake, relax, I said. Nobody's making any cracks about your goddamn religion. I got off Eli's bed and I started towards the door. I didn't want to hang around in that stupid atmosphere anymore. Okay, just like here, similar ideas. This main idea that I want to convey in these first 10 chapters, okay, is the idea that Holden Caulfield isn't actually mad at the institutions and the organizations themselves. He's mad at the phony people who are using it, exploiting it for their own means, and who are running the show, who don't actually represent the purest and kindest and the most, virtuous leaders that possible, okay? He thinks that someone who's running the church, who should be in the church, who is a believer of the church, okay, should be someone who follows all the values of that religion. But in this case, he sees Ackley, who's meant to be, this great Catholic or whatever, who is kind of contravening that with his actions. He also sees, talks about, these weird monks or whatever. He thinks that there are phony people in the church who are using the church to make themselves seem better, but they themselves are actually rotten on the inside. One final quote from chapter 9. I didn't want to start an argument, okay, I said. Then I thought of something all of a sudden. Hey, listen, I said, you know those ducks in that lagoon right near Central Park South, that little lake? By any chance, do you happen to know where they go, the ducks, when it gets all frozen over? Do you happen to know by any chance? I realized it was only one chance in a million. He turned around and looked at me like I was a madman. What are you trying to do, bud? He said. Kid me? No, I was just interested, that's all. He didn't say anything more, so I didn't either, until we came out of the park at 90th Street. Then he said, all right, buddy, where to? So, here, we really get a sense of Holden Caulfield's, one of his main concerns throughout the rest of the novel, which is the idea of mortality, the idea of people dying. Holden Caulfield is obsessed with the idea of death. Now, not just with his own death and his sister's death and his parents' death. He's obsessed with the idea that everything dies, and he's trying to confront that idea. Now, this was certainly relevant, of course, in the post-war environment, especially after the dropping of the nuclear bomb, right? People were worried about death. They started thinking about death more because they had seen so much death around them. And people were dealing with it in different ways. Some people turned to religion. Some people turned to, just working as hard as they could to earn money for their kids. And some people, they just gave up. They just, became what we will talk about next week, nihilists and existentialists, and they created new religions and new philosophies and stuff like that to deal with the idea of, everyone is going to die. And Holden Caulfield is an example of someone who is kind of standing on the outside. He's fascinated with the idea, but he doesn't really know how to deal with it. So we're going to talk more about that next week. So your question for this week, for week 2, is this. why does Holden Caulfield rebel against so many different institutions? And what do you think J.D. Salinger is actually trying to say? Now, I've already answered a little bit of the question in this video, but I want you to maybe do some research, use your own thoughts, and try to answer that question a little bit better than what I've already said. Okay, so once again, why does Holden Caulfield rebel against all these institutions, and what is J.D. Salinger actually trying to say? Okay, I'll see you next week.